Hello, beautiful people, and welcome. Hi to the patch 5.1 second half banner review. We're getting two reruns. We're getting Nahida and Hu Tao, along with Kuki, Xingqiu, and Sethos as the 4-stars. Weapon banner, obviously we have the signatures for Nahida and Hu Tao, and we have Favonius Warbow, Lion's Roar, Dragon's Bane, Eye of Perception, and a new Claymore, the Fruitful Hook. As usual, we're going to start by talking about the limited 5-stars that are on banner. Hu Tao is a character that she's been on a roller coaster when it comes to how strong people perceive her to be. Back on her release, people tended to be worse at the game, so VV Vape wasn't that popular, but that was definitely the best team at the time. People tended to play double Geo with Albedo Zhongli. Later on, the release of Yelan made the default Hu Tao team that most people went for double Hydro instead of only Xingqiu. So Zhongli, Xingqiu, Yelan, and Xiangling, Xingqiu, Yelan were like the two main Hu Tao teams. But then relatively recently, Xianyun's release has given her the possibility to make use of Farina pretty well. And because she doesn't really have a great artifact set, using Farina also enables you to use Briochebun on her, which is really, really nice because, well, obviously Farina already gives a buff, but then on top of that, the buff you get from using an artifact set that gives you a lot more stats is pretty big. And then very, very recently, this very patch, Shalonen's release has given Hu Tao another last slot in her teams that can enable Farina as a second Hydro option over Xingqiu Yelan. Right now, Hu Tao is in a pretty good spot in terms of power, but people don't perceive her to be as strong as they used to because of Arlecchino. Arlecchino is a character who is outside of the potential to die because she can't get healed, generally going to perform better than Hu Tao. If you're looking at very difficult chambers with really high HP totals, Arlecchino's ability to have her Bond of Life carry over, whatever leftover Bond of Life on your first rotation carries over to the second rotation, which makes her DPS over multiple rotations higher than her DPS on the first rotation alone. But then on top of that, the fact that within one rotation, her damage is very front-loaded. Most of her damage happens in the first few attacks because obviously her damage scales with how much Bond of Life she has, and she loses Bond of Life when she attacks. So at the very beginning, when she has the most Bond of Life, is when she does the most of her damage. That means that when things go wrong, when your setup takes a bit longer because you had to dodge, because the enemies moved, anything like that, Arlecchino's ability to front-load a lot of her rotation's damage means that she doesn't get punished as much from those kinds of situations. Hu Tao, on the other hand, is very, very straightforward in her rotations. She's very inflexible, I guess. Once you swap to her, you can't swap out, which is not the case for Arlecchino. And because of that, Hu Tao has somewhat fallen out of favor with the general player base in the past few months. However, that doesn't mean that Hu Tao is bad. There's two main points that I want to emphasize when it comes to Hu Tao for this rerun. Number one, people tend to overestimate the difference between carries that are better than one another. And just because Arlecchino is arguably overall better than Hu Tao, it doesn't mean that Hu Tao is unplayable. It's very far from that, actually. And the second one is, despite both of them being Pyro, Polearm, normal / charge attack focused carries, it is actually very possible to play both of them without unit overlap. And so a direct comparison between Hu Tao and Arlecchino isn't really that relevant. For example, the two Arlecchino teams that I've enjoyed the most lately have been Arlecchino, Bennett, Xilonen, Kea, and Xilonen, Zhongli. Although I have also played in the past Arlecchino, Zhongli, Kazuha, Zhongli, Zhongli, Xiangling, Kazuha, Xiangling. And as it turns out, Hu Tao's arguably best team has no unit overlap with all those Arlecchino teams whatsoever. Right, Yelan and Xingqiu being usable here, but if you want to play Vape Hu Tao team, if you want to play Vape Arlecchino, you can do something like this, or the other way around. All this to say, just because two units are carries of the same element, doesn't mean that they're necessarily great comparisons between one another. If anything, I'd say that Hu Tao has a lot closer of a comparison to a character like Alhaitham, who actually has a strong incentive to be played with Xingqiu, despite Alhaitham being another element entirely. Or even Xiao, because of Xiao's synergy with Xianyun and Farina. I think people tend to get stuck on the element of carries when comparing them between each other. And I think in most situations, the more relevant comparison is carries that use the same support, not carries of the same element. There's actually not that many situations where you absolutely cannot play a carry of a given element. There are some, don't get me wrong. Obviously, there's some enemies that are immune to elements, but they don't actually happen all that often. All in all, Hu Tao is a pretty solid carry. That's definitely in the upper half of carries, who performs pretty well in pretty much any vape team, but is borderline unplayable in teams that aren't vape. The next up, we can talk about Nahida. I think Nahida is one of those units that people tend to forget about. Not that they think Nahida is bad, but the fact that Nahida has gotten so little support in recent months / even years at this point. While there have been characters that can use Nahida in some of their teams, I don't think there really have been any characters who have been reliant on Nahida pretty much since Sumeru. Clorraine is probably the closest one to it, but even then, she's not actually 100% reliant on Nahida. She has team options that don't use her. Because of that, people kind of tend to forget about her because it's pretty much been years since she's been relevant for a new character. However, as it turns out, she was already very strong on her release, and I definitely do not think Nahida is a character that has been overshadowed by recent characters. Teams that use Nahida are still very strong, and Nahida is still a very strong option. In some of the newer characters' teams, like Molani, she's viable, but in the team options that we had on her release, or around her release in Sumeru, she was and is still quite strong. One of the things that I like the most about Nahida is that the teams that you can make with her tend to be teams that can reach the Abyss DPS thresholds with very little investment compared to other teams, both in terms of what units you have to pull for and in terms of artifact investment, which means that it makes it a lot easier to focus entirely on your other side. If we look at many of the strong characters that have been released in the past year and a half, outside of Molani, Laurent, and Neuvillette, Bennett is really good with these carries. Bennett is great with Navia, with Arlecchino, with Risley, with Kanich. And being reliant on Bennett on one side with pretty much any of those characters means you can't use Bennett on the other side, which heavily reduces the amount of team options that don't rely on a bunch of 5 stars for your other side. And Nahida, pretty much by herself, fixes that potential issues for newer accounts. If you're someone who is a relatively newer account, you went for Arlecchino, maybe you got Kazuhan or Rerun, but you still don't have a great other side, Nahida is the sort of unit that can be very, very powerful. Or if you're starting your account now in this banner, having Nahida for one of your sides makes it so that you pretty much already have one side out of the way and you can go for carries and even weapons if you want to, entirely for the other side. Personally, I've been playing Hyperbloom a lot less these days because I've played Hyperbloom a lot in the past, and at some point you kind of get tired of it. And because most of the new characters, which are the new shiny exciting things, aren't really Hyperbloom units. But if I want to play the new shiny exciting things, that rules out playing Hyperbloom. But Hyperbloom is still one of the team archetypes I go for when I want to do a brainless clear on my account. And it still does quite well. Something that's very, very nice for Nahida on this banner is that the 4 stars are also really good for Hyperbloom. This banner is honestly not that great for longtime players. A lot of longtime players either already have Nahida or have pretty high constellation on their Xingqiu already. So for longtime players, this isn't really the best banner, and you're not really going to get too much out of it. But for newer players that maybe don't have Xingqiu constellations maxed out yet, don't have Kuki, or don't have her C2, being able to get Nahida while building up your Xingqiu cons and your Kuki cons on the way is an insanely efficient way of improving your Hyperbloom teams. Speaking of which, let's start talking about Kuki. Kuki is a character that's not entirely exclusively used in Hyperbloom, but really mostly used in Hyperbloom. She is technically also a viable option in Chevreuse teams if you need healing, as well as a decent option in Quicken teams, whether they're Aggravate or Spread teams, if you, again, need healing. Hyper Bloom aside, she mainly sees play in Alhaitham teams that are Quicken teams. But really, the main place you're going to see her is in Hyper Bloom teams. Kuki in Hyper Bloom teams is a more defensive focused option. When you look at default Hyperloom stuff, because Hyperloom only scales with EM, and because it scales quite well with EM, and the EM is doing a lot for you, having to sacrifice EM main stats tends to make your Hyperloom teams a lot worse, which is the main reason why the better Hyperloom triggers tend to be the ones that can trigger it with their skill rather than their burst. Not having to build any ER makes your rotations a lot easier to execute. That's why the main off-field Hyperloom triggers are Kuki and Raiden. And so between Kuki and Raiden, who is the better one? Raiden offensively is much better. She gives you a burst damage buff, and she gives you faster Hyperloom triggers by hitting with Electro more often. However, in exchange for that, she doesn't have any defensive utility. Kuki, on the other hand, has lower uptime. Her skill base duration is 12 seconds. With Constellations, it goes up to 15, which technically is 100% uptime if you use it off cooldown, but unless you're playing a team that can swap as much as it wants, if you're playing any Hyperloom team that uses a dedicated on-fielder, if you're using something like Kutsing, Clarion, Sino, Alhaitham, you're not really going to be able to have 100% uptime on this. You'll have to sacrifice uptime even with C2. But in exchange for that, you get healing. The amount of healing is okay. It's single target only healing, so it's only for the active character, which means that Kuki's not the best character at stacking your fanfare if you're playing her with Farina. But it is good enough that you will get some fanfare stacks. Overall, her constellations make a pretty big difference. The difference between C0 and C6 Kuki is noticeable. But the biggest benchmark is C2. Increasing skill duration by 3 seconds is a massive deal. That's 2 more procs of your Hyper Bloom, which is really, really nice. And 2 more procs of healing. C1 increases the burst AoE, which doesn't really matter too much. C3 is skill level. This isn't entirely useless. A lot of people might see this and be like, well, if you're playing her in Hyper Bloom, you're building her full EM, so she's not doing much damage. But as it turns out, even including the fact that her EM increases the amount she heals from her skill, the base healing increasing based on her HP, even if you're not built full HP, still actually makes a difference on your healing between C2 and C3. Right, C3 is a little bit more healing. This is going to be especially noticeable in Farina teams where actually maxing out your HP, like fully healing your character, procs Farina's Ascension passive, so it's a lot more important to have slightly better healing. But even in other teams, it is a nice little constellation, even if it doesn't do too much. C4 gives you additional Electro App. It's alright, it's a nice constellation. C5 is burst level, which is not particularly good. And then C6 makes her invulnerable when she dies up to once every 60 seconds. Technically it also buffs her, but you're not going out of your way to trigger this, so the buff doesn't really matter too much. Because Kuki damages herself when using her skill, having something that prevents her from dying is actually a really big deal. Her healing doesn't kick in until the first tick of her skill after the cast, and unless you're using your burst, you'll be swapping out before that happens, which means you're gonna sacrifice HP, but you're not gonna heal it back up. That means you're gonna end up pretty low HP, and that makes it very easy to die. Personally, I tend to die more when I have Kuki on my team, because Kuki dies, than I do when I have Raiden on my team without a healer. That's not going to be the case for everyone, but that is something that is still worth a mention. All in all, Kuki is definitely one of the better 4-star characters, and because a lot of people are averse to the idea of pulling for Raiden just for Hyper Bloom, and also just because having Kuki means you won't have to pull for a 5-star to enable your Hyper Bloom. You'll be able to make your Hyper Bloom work without having to spend wishes on an additional 5-star character. She is an incredibly valuable character for especially newer accounts, but she's also pretty good for older accounts as well. Next, let's talk about Sethos. It's very hard for me to give a particularly in-depth assessment of Sethos. I have played him very little because he's not leveled on my account, because I cannot be bothered exploring Sumeru Desert and getting his f***ing Ascension materials. They're a massive pain in the ass to get, and I just don't wanna. Sethos is playable in a few different teams, pretty much only Dendro teams. Generally, it's gonna be either Big Bloom or or aggravate teams. He is reasonably strong. The difference between having his constellations and not having them is pretty big, so C0 Sethos tends to perform a little bit worse, let's say. But even at C0, because aggravate teams are so heavily carried by Fischl being broken, he's still very playable. Sethos is one of the carries that tends to be the most difficult to play well, so that's something to keep in mind if you're thinking about going for him. Actually playing Sethos well is difficult. The payoff for that is also not really all that high. If you're okay with that, he's fine, but really, I don't have that much to say about him. He's a fine character that is a little bit more difficult to play than most other characters, and that rewards you with a pretty average payoff. Finally, Xingqiu. You may already know what I think about Xingqiu, and if you don't, this is probably your first video that you're watching on my channel. Welcome. I hope you go down and press the subscribe button. Xingqiu is a character who, before taking into account comparisons with other characters, giving a base description of what he does and the sort of stuff he enables, he's a good off-field hydro applicator that has a reasonable personal damage, but more importantly, that has an insane amount of hydro application, which is going to be incredibly useful in teams where either you desperately want to keep a hydro aura, or in teams that reward you directly for triggering hydro reactions as often as possible. So basically, for the former being vape teams and the latter being hyperloom teams. What truly makes Xingqiu a really, really strong unit is the fact that on top of that reasonable offensive damage and very, very good off-field hydro application, he also has very good defensive utility. He gives you decent resistance to interruption, as well as a very large amount of damage reduction, which reduces incoming damage by upwards of 40-something%. With all of that being said, as much as it pains me to admit, Hoyo has acknowledged Xingqiu. They have realized the abomination that they've created, and because of that, they have slowly but surely started to move away from characters that capitalize on his strengths. If you look at the list of recent characters, you'll see characters that can't use Xingqiu because they don't do normal attacks, characters that have some form of resistance to interruption, either directly in their kit or indirectly by having synergy with characters that give resistance to interruption, which completely removes the upside of some of Xingqiu's defensive utility, that aren't really that reliant on the reaction portion of their damage in vape, that don't attack fast enough, or that get actually punished by how good Xingqiu's hydro application is because it can steal their vapes, or that heavily encourage specific characters or specific elements that are not what Xingqiu gives. There's still some characters that synergize well with him, Grizzly, but there are a lot less. Because of that, while the teams that use Xingqiu did not get any worse, the amount of team options that do not use Xingqiu has increased. You have more and more options when it comes to teams that just don't really need or even want him. Xingqiu is still very much the most important / impactful 4-star for an early account. However, when you start looking at accounts that are older, more and more of them are starting to have two teams that don't use Xingqiu on either side. And so his overwhelming dominance in the meta is definitely winding down. Is Xingqiu bad now? No. He's still the GOAT. He's still really strong, and if you think Xingqiu's bad, you're just delusional. But he is a lot less important than he used to be. What are his constellations like? C1 is pretty much useless. It slightly increases the healing that he does, but his healing is not very good to begin with, and it doesn't increase it by that much. C2 is very nice, increases burst duration and shreds hydro res. C3 is alright, increases burst damage. C4 is situationally massive, but most of the time really not a big deal. It's really nice if you end up vaping your skill hits, but if you're not vaping them, then it's really not all that significant. C5, similar to C4, but just worse. And then C6 increases the amount of hydro application that you have and reduces his ER requirements, which is also really good. All in all, Xingqiu is still one of the best units in the game, so he's still the sort of character you're really happy to see on a banner, especially because he's one of the great 4-stars that actually benefits a lot from constellations. So unless you already have him at C6, he's a very welcome sight. So how good are these banners overall? Well, if you're planning on going for Hu Tao, you get Xingqiu with her, and Xingqiu is still very much a pleasant Hu Tao teammate. Ever since Farina's release, there have been some good non-Xingqiu Hu Tao teams. Before Farina, Yelan by herself was a little scuffed to make work in solo Hydro, but Yelan plus Farina is more than enough. So Farina's release gave you some double Hydro team options that don't use Xingqiu. Personally, I still don't like them as much as the Xingqiu versions because the defensive utility is very valuable to me, but he's not necessary for Hu Tao anymore. But he's still nice to get in a Hu Tao banner. Kuki, Sethos, not great for Hu Tao, not really what you're looking for. With Nahida, if you are someone who really likes Sethos, getting Nahida constellations can be something to consider. Even though Sethos has teams that don't use Nahida with Kirara instead of Nahida as the Dendro option. But then outside of that, if you're going for Nahida, Kuki and Xingqiu are obviously amazing options for Hyperloom teams. Very, very nice banner for that. Personally, I'm not going to go for either of these banners because I'm not interested in constellations on Hu Tao or Nahida. But if you care about constellations, we can very quickly go over the relevant things to say. Nahida's C1 basically doesn't exist. Nahida's C2 is very good. Nahida's constellations 3, 4, and 5 basically don't exist. And her C6 is pretty good. I think that, as far as I'm concerned, if your Nahida is at a constellation that is not 0, 2, or 6, I will look at you with surprise and disdain. If you got it by accident, that's fine, obviously. Like, just because you accidentally got C1 doesn't mean you should go for C2 necessarily. But if you, like, went out of your way to get, like, C3 Nahida, I'm very confused. Hu Tao has one constellation. If your Hu Tao is higher than C1, I'm also very confused by you. Hu Tao has some of the worst constellations past C1 out of any of the limited 5 stars. They're really bad. Don't go for them. If you are thinking about getting constellations, you're probably also thinking potentially about getting signature weapons and going for this weapon banner. We have the age-old C1 or Homa debate, and the answer to that question has somewhat oscillated between the two in recent months. Qianyun's release made Hu Tao's C1 a lot less valuable, but then Qilonen's release reintroduced C1 as a good option for her. Obviously, if you're playing Hu Tao in a Qianyun team, you're gonna do jump cancels because you want to plunge, which means that the maintaining your stamina thanks to C1 doesn't really do anything because you don't really want to do dash cancels. But Qilonen being a replacement for Qianyun in the Hu Tao, Farina, Hydro. Qilonen being a replacement for Qianyun in the healer slot there has made it so that if that's the team you're playing, obviously C1 is going to start mattering again. I would still probably lean towards Homa over C1, mainly because Homa can also be used on other characters, but really, you can kind of go for either. Or both. I'd rather have a C1 or 1 Hu Tao than a C6 or 0 Hu Tao. Next, we have 1,000 Floating Dreams, and this weapon is ass. The buff that 1,000 Floating Dreams gives to your team is very, very low. Or very, very small. The team buff that it gives is 40 EM, which is 2 substats. It's really small, which means that it's barely a support weapon, and it's more so a personal damage weapon. It gives a bunch of EM, and then either more EM or damage percent. It's actually a reasonable option on characters that care about EM when it comes to damage. Mainly with Molani's release, 1,000 Floating Dreams is generally up there as one of the best 5-star options that are not the signature. But there's no reason to go for this over Molani's signature if you're looking for a weapon from Molani. On Nahida herself, she doesn't tend to have all that much personal damage in her teams, which makes 1,000 Floating Dreams really not that significant when it comes to how it impacts your team DPS. If you have it, it generally will be your best option, but by such a small margin that I very, very rarely would recommend it. Personally, I'm a Favonius enjoyer. Even if I had this, I'd probably leave my Nahida on Fav all the time, but that's just because I have a problem and I have an addiction, and yeah. Next, we have the 4-star weapons. We have Favonius Warbow, which is pretty good. It's a good Fav weapon, but unlike every other Fav weapon, Fav Warbow is given for free to everyone. You get it for free from one of the Mondstadt quests very early on, which means that you're guaranteed to already have at least one. So unless you're going specifically for refines or you need to have Fav Warbow on multiple characters, then it being on a banner isn't as impactful. But the refines are useful. and there are a decent amount of characters that use it, so it's still a relatively nice weapon to get, above average for bows. Lion's Roar is kind of ass. It used to be that the only attack percent substat swords back in 1.0 were Lion's Roar and the Flute, and as long as you could make use of the passive, Lion's Roar was a lot better than the Flute, because the Flute's passive is dog. But in Inazuma, we got another attack percent substat weapon for ER hungry characters, and then in Fontaine we got another attack percent weapon that is just a bunch of attack as a stat stick with a trigger condition that isn't that difficult to fulfill. Basically, Amenoma and Finale of the Deep being added to the options for craftable weapons have made Lion's Roar's value completely plummet from 1.0 to today. I'd say that Lion's Roar is now one of the worst swords you can get on a weapon banner. Personally, I still use it because I use all of my sword prototypes on max refining my sapwood blade, and I don't want to spend all my billets on a minor upgrade because I already have an R5 Lion's Roar. But honestly, even if I didn't have it fully refined, I wouldn't be happy to see it on a banner. Eye of Perception is dog. Technically, there are some Catalyst characters on which, as an offensive option, it's like reasonable, but it's never much better than reasonable. Dragon's Bane is best in slot on EM Raiden, Hog, but jokes aside, Dragon's Bane is good on EM Raiden, but the refines don't matter. And then outside of that, it's a very good 4-star option for Hu Tao if you don't have her signature. Unlike Deathmatch, it doesn't give you crit rate, which means that if you're playing Hu Tao in a Farina team where you're using her on Mahjong, it may be difficult to get a crit ratio that doesn't make you overcap if you're also using Deathmatch, because Deathmatch is a weapon that gives you low base attack, high substat, so it gives you a lot of crit rate, so it makes it very easy to overcap. Dragon's Bane doesn't have that problem, so if you have a high refined Dragon's Bane, that can be quite nice for Hu Tao. But that's kind of it. Raiden and Hu Tao are pretty much the only two characters on which Dragon's Bane is something you actually want. The other characters that can use Dragon's Bane would pretty much always rather use the catch, right? Changeling, Rosaria, kind of it really. Technically, if you're playing a Virgin team with Toma, Dragon's Bane is viable, but his ER requirements are generally really difficult to fulfill, which means that generally you'd rather have him on Kitane Cross Spear, which is also an EM weapon. It gives you less EM, but in exchange it gives you a bunch of energy. Same if you're playing Candace and Nilo teams. And then finally, we have the new Claymore, the Fruitful Hook. For the first time in a pretty long time, is an actually good 4-star limited weapon. It's very situational. You don't want to use this on pretty much anyone other than Diluc and Gaming. And then on top of that, both Diluc and Gaming in the teams where you'd use this would use Maréchaussée, and then Gaming C6 gives them 20% crit rate, and Diluc has crit rate Ascension. So it's really, really easy to overcap from the crit rate on plunge attacks here. But if you manage to balance your build and to not overcap, Fruitful Hook is going to be the best 4-star option for Gaming and Diluc in those plunge teams, even above Serpent Spine if you have it at high enough refine. 64 CV and 32 damage percent is an insane amount of stats. At R1, it's not going to be better than high refined Serpent Spine, but it's going to be at least competitive with R1 Serpent Spine. And then at R5, it's going to blow it out of the water. However, getting a bunch of refines on a specific limited 4-star weapon that is not available in the standard banner is, one, on average, really damn expensive to begin with, but also, 2, not something that's regulated by pity. There's no actual upper limit to how many wishes it can take to R5 this weapon. And so I would 100% not recommend going on this banner specifically for this. If that's what you're doing, you're better off going on a banner where a Claymore is the signature weapon and just using a 5-star Claymore. But if you get a bunch of Fruitful Hooks as a byproduct of trying to go for Homa, good for you. Overall, this weapon banner is not very good. Homa is obviously nice on Hu Tao, and it's a reasonable stat stick, but Hu Tao is a character that's fallen out of favor a decent amount lately, so I don't think there's too many people left that like Hu Tao enough to get Homa and that don't already have it, especially considering how many times she's been rerun already. And then losing your 50-50 to 1,000 Floating Dreams is not particularly good. On the other hand, if you really, really like Nahida and you want to get her signature, losing your 50-50 to Homa is fine. Homa is a pretty good 5-star stat stick, but it's not great anymore. And then the 4-star lineup, Fruitful Hook is nice. Fav Bow is alright, but when it comes to favs, it's one of the weaker ones. And then Dragon's Bane, it's kind of redundant on a banner that already has Homa. And then I have Perception and Lion's Roar are pretty ass. I'd say this is a slightly below average banner with slightly below average 5 stars and slightly below average 4 stars. And that is going to be it for the banner reviews. I hope you all learned a thing or two. As usual, make sure you do the YouTube stuff. I already told you guys, but I'm telling you again. Subscribe, like, comment. And yeah, I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye, YouTube.